Imagine waking up to find your belongings rearranged, cryptic messages scrawled on the mirror, and an unseen force seemingly hell-bent on destroying your entire family. For the Moffitts, this wasn't just a nightmare. It was their reality. From ancient rituals to demonic entities, this haunting case challenges everything that we think we know about the paranormal. Prepare yourself for one of the most puzzling and terrifying paranormal stories ever recorded. Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to The Oddest. From 1987 until 1992, the Moffitt family lived in Rancho Cucamonga, Southern California, where they faced numerous paranormal incidents. One of the creepiest was finding messages written on the bathroom mirror with soap. These hauntings happened so often that the family started calling the strange demon-like presence Mr. Entity. Deborah Moffitt, the main witness to these strange events, eventually wrote 2 books about the terrifying experiences that spanned several years and multiple homes. Her story was also featured in several documentaries, capturing the attention of paranormal researchers and enthusiasts. Even today, these events continue to fascinate those interested in the supernatural. While most of the strange happenings started back in 1987, the trigger for these bizarre events likely dates back to 1984. This was the year that Deborah married Bill Moffitt Jr. and moved into his family home on Archibald Avenue in Los Angeles. The Moffitts owned 3 houses on the same street. Deborah and Bill Jr. lived in the house belonging to Bill Jr.'s parents, Bill Sr. and Lena, who was often called Lee. On one side of this house was Bill Jr.'s own house, which he inherited from his aunt after she passed away. On the other side of the house was his grandmother's house. She was called Dominica. At first, everything seemed fine with the living arrangements. Bill Jr. even planned to rent out his property to earn some extra cash. However, things took a turn when Dominica, who had suffered a stroke a few weeks earlier, returned home from hospital. This event might have set off the strange and eerie occurrences that would plague the family in the years to come. It soon became abundantly clear that Dominica needed much more care than the family had originally expected. She required round-the-clock attention. By coincidence, a local woman named Juanita, who had recently moved to the United States from Guatemala, learned that the family needed some extra help. Since she also needed a job to maintain her work visa, she offered her services, which the family gladly accepted. At first, everything seemed to be settled again. However, a foreboding change was just around the corner. Although Dominica's health seemed to improve at first, she became increasingly ill over the following weeks and didn't respond to her medication as first expected. Looking back now, this decline in Dominica's health might have been the beginning of the strange and surreal events that followed. Wanting to help the family, and perhaps worried about her job, Juanita turned to her religious practices for some assistance, specifically the ritual practices of Santeria. Santeria, an ancient religion practiced throughout the Caribbean, involves ritualistic blood sacrifices. Followers use these rituals to communicate and bargain with ancient deities from other realms, offering sacrifices as payment for good luck and good fortune. It seemed that this was what Juanita was attempting to do when Dominica's health started to deteriorate. Shortly after her health had declined, Dominica passed away. The next day, Bill Jr. and Bill Sr. went to Dominica's house and found Juanita severely distressed and in a state of utter shock. They tried to calm her down, but it was clear that she was utterly terrified by something. Juanita believed that someone or something was after her. Even more bizarre, she kept insisting over and over that she was only trying to help. The family finally called a relative to come and take her away. Before she left though, she gave them a final warning. Specifically to Lee, which would become important later. She told them to stay out of Dominica's house, saying that there was something evil residing within there. In the years that followed, the family would think a lot about what Juanita might have meant by this. They wondered what she had been up to in the days leading up to Dominica's death and what kind of power she might have unleashed on their once peaceful Los Angeles suburb. Several weeks after Dominica had passed, her family entered her home to clear out all of the unwanted items and retrieve some of her cherished belongings. However, what they found inside was like a scene from a horror movie. Strange symbols were carved and etched into the walls, and several knives were scattered randomly around the house. There were also multiple candles, some unused and some were burnt right down. Even more disturbing though, they discovered feathers scattered everywhere, along with bloodstains and splatters. Although the family didn't really understand all this at the time, it seems like these could be signs of some kind of ritual blood sacrifice. Despite these eerie discoveries though, the family gradually returned to their normal lives, and for several years this was the case. Nothing unusual actually happened. By 1987, Deborah and Bill Jr. were still living with Bill's parents. Meanwhile, Bill Jr. had rented out his own property to a local man named Danny. However, there was one special condition attached to Danny's rental agreement. See, Bill Jr. had a huge sports memorabilia collection, so large in fact that he needed an extra room in the property that he was renting to Danny just to store some of it. Danny had access to the rest of the house, totally free because, well, he was renting it. But this particular room was off limits and kept locked. Although it seemed a bit strange, Danny was actually okay with this arrangement. One day while Bill Jr. was in the room looking for a very specific item, he noticed something unusual. Several collectible bobbleheads that usually sat on shelves had been taken down and arranged on the floor in the shape of a triangle. Puzzled by this, Bill Jr. initially thought that, well, Danny must have somehow entered the room and was playing a prank on him. He put the bobbleheads back just where they were on the shelf and asked Danny about this later on. However, instead of laughing along with this, Danny insisted that he hadn't been in that room at all and certainly hadn't touched any bobbleheads. Bill Jr. tried to brush this off and put it out of his mind, but the strange events were just the beginning. Strange things started happening at Bill Jr.'s parents' house right after they found something odd in his sports memorabilia room. Lee was the first to notice these creepy events. She had a small altar in her bedroom where she prayed every night before going to sleep. One morning she woke up to find someone had draped underwear over the statue of Jesus on her altar. Although Lee was a bit worried about finding the underwear on the statue, she didn't really mention it to the rest of the family. But, as I said before, this was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, Lee noticed other strange objects showing up on her altar. One morning, there was a man's watch. Another morning, a piece of men's jewellery just randomly appeared. Then, one day, she woke up to find a wallet on the altar. When she looked inside the wallet, she discovered that it belonged to their neighbour and renter, Danny. They soon learned that Danny was missing his watch also. They guessed that these other items on the altar probably belonged to him as well. Unsure of how to explain this entire situation, they decided to wait until Danny was out and then quietly return the items back to the house. But to their surprise and shock, a few days later, the same items reappeared on the altar. And then, believe it or not, things got even stranger. One day, not long after these odd events had started, Danny knocked on Bill Sr. and Lee's door to tell them that he was moving out. He could only give them 24 hours notice because he had to move out quick and he would be gone the next day. True to his word, Danny left the following day. The family decided to go inside his now empty house to check out what was going on. They were puzzled to find that Danny had left many of his belongings behind, but the strangest discovery was yet to come. Each light switch had strange symbols drawn on them with crayon. A few days later, while tidying up and getting rid of any unwanted items, Deborah found herself alone in the house. As she was doing her chores, she noticed a row of ornamental dogs on a shelf, all facing outwards. She looked away for just a split second, and when she heard a strange scraping noise, she looked back and all of the dogs had been turned around to face the wall. However, when Deborah told Bill Jr. about this, he dismissed it completely, saying that she must have just imagined it. Determined to prove it to himself, he made a mental note of where everything was in the house right before he left for the night. The very next morning, he returned to the house. At first, everything seemed in its place, just like he left it. But then, he noticed a lamp that had been in the corner of the room the night before was now in the middle of the floor. He told Deborah about this and she became absolutely convinced that something truly unusual was happening here. In fact, she was so furious that while they were both standing in the kitchen discussing this, she yelled out that whoever or whatever is responsible for this, just stop it. Stop being a coward, and she demanded that they show themselves immediately. Well, they waited, and after a few moments, nothing happened. They kinda shrugged it off and almost laughed with each other. She felt a bit silly for doing so. I mean, I don't know what she expected. But then, in a split second, the large kitchen table screeched across the floor as if some angry, unseen hands had yanked the table away from them. After these unsettling events, Bill Jr. and Deborah told Bill Sr. and Lee about all of these strange occurrences. Lee, who had experienced her own bizarre discoveries, immediately recalled Juanita's warning from the day that she left with her family and became convinced that something supernatural was at play here. In stark contrast, Bill Sr. seemed largely uninterested, insisting that it was just his family's overactive imaginations causing all this fuss. Despite these events, the strange activity seemed to die down a little bit over the next few weeks. Things got so calm that Bill Jr. managed to rent out the property yet again, this time to a young couple named Tom and Michelle. As they moved in, Bill joked that the building might be haunted, but they didn't seem too worried about this. For the first few weeks, nothing unusual happened during Tom and Michelle's stay there. However, one morning, Deborah found Michelle sitting on her doorstep, looking rather upset. When Deborah walked over, she noticed that Michelle had a bruise on her face. Deborah asked what had happened, and Michelle immediately broke down, revealing that Tom had hit her after an argument. She emphasised that this was completely out of character for Tom. In fact, ever since they moved into that house, she had noticed a dramatic change in Tom's personality. He had gone from gentle, loving and reserved to aggressive and violent. Within just a few days, Michelle was seemingly nowhere to be seen. When Deborah asked Tom about Michelle's whereabouts, he offered that they had had an argument and as a result Michelle had moved out and ultimately ended their relationship. Even stranger though, less than a week later, Tom had also moved out, and he did so without giving the family any notice or any explanation. They waited several more weeks just in case the couple decided to return to retrieve some of their things, and when they were sure that Tom and or Michelle wasn't coming back, they went into the property to check its condition. Unlike previous times though, they found the house to be in perfect condition, almost like it was never lived in. In fact, it looked like the entire place had been cleaned spotless from top to bottom. However, they did notice a large rug was missing. Given that they had anticipated finding something, they simply assumed that the rug had been damaged and then discarded. Then, after several days, a gentleman knocked on the Moffitts' front door asking to speak with Tom. When Deborah informed the man that, Tom used to be their tenant and he moved out several weeks previous, the man bluntly informed Deborah that his girlfriend Michelle had been discovered dead. Her body was dumped in a nearby landfill and wrapped in an old, large rug. According to what this mystery man told her, she had been beaten to death. The man then turned and left without identifying who he was or who he worked for. Needless to say, Deborah was a little shaken by this news. When she told this to her husband Bill Jr. about this entire incident, he insisted that he hadn't seen any reports of a woman's body being discovered nearby. Despite this though, Deborah thought that they should maybe just contact the police and inform them about this mysterious man, as well as the fact that they knew that Tom and Michelle were having problems. However, Bill Sr. became quite agitated and insisted that they not contact the police. In fact, he said that they should just forget about this entire matter. After experiencing a strange series of events, the Moffitt family decided to sell all three of the houses on Archibald Avenue. They planned to buy a larger house in another part of the city, hoping that moving away would put an end to the odd occurrences that had troubled them now for months. However, once they put their house on the market, that's when the bizarre activity intensified. Objects were frequently moved around the house, and pictures or paintings were often found turned around and facing the wall on a daily basis. Even stranger though, several items mysteriously vanished into thin air. With the house for sale, the Moffitt family decided to endure these unsettling events as best they could whilst waiting for the move. Finally, the day arrived for them to move into their new home. However, whatever was behind these strange, eerie incidents seemed determined not to let the family leave so quietly. As Deborah and Lee, the two women of the household, were gathering last-minute items before finally leaving, they suddenly heard a huge, booming crash coming from the kitchen. Rushing down there to investigate, they found that one of the kitchen cupboards had been ripped completely off the wall and then hurled across the floor. As they stood there stunned by the wreckage, they heard the sound of breaking glass as every single window in the house shattered all at the same time. By now the Moffitt family was desperate to leave Archibald Avenue, but even after they had moved, these strange events continued to follow them. Just like before, the strange activity suddenly calmed down, making the Moffitts believe that they had finally managed to escape the menacing entity. However, as months passed, the unsettling incidents slowly resumed. Along with the usual disturbances of moved objects and turned pictures, the family was often awakened in the middle of the night by their burglar alarm. Each time it went off, they found the house empty with no signs of a break-in. More unsettling than that though, the Moffitts began to hear sudden screams from the upper floors of their new home. Equally chilling, they started hearing their names being whispered when they were the only ones in the room. Then came the direct communication. One day, Lee walked into the bathroom and found the phrase, "Talk to me," written on the mirror in soap. After everyone in the family denied playing this prank, Deborah wiped the message away to see if another one would appear. Only moments later, a new message showed up, reading, "No escape." These bizarre and often cryptic messages continued over the following days and weeks, ranging from unclear to outright hostile. The most disturbing was a message that read, "I hate Lee." This prompted Bill Sr. to demand that whoever was responsible reveal themselves immediately. The next day, in apparent response, the word "Prince" appeared on the mirror. The family had decided to ask a local priest to bless the house, which he did. However, this only seemed to aggravate whatever force was behind these messages and strange activities, with particular focus on Lee. For instance, messages like "Lee die" were discovered on the mirror. One evening, after returning home from a night out with friends, the Moffitts discovered a strange triangular symbol drawn all over the house, on the walls, on the floors. It was the same shape in which the bobbleheads had been arranged at their old property. Terrified by all this, Bill Sr. and Lee moved to the lower floors with Bill Jr. and Deborah. Almost immediately, messages began to appear there as well, still primarily targeting Lee. As the months passed, the Moffitts started researching the paranormal and invited various investigators to their home in an attempt to understand what was going on and find out what was behind these bizarre incidents. One team of psychics suggested that the force behind the activity was an ancient entity, and a very powerful one. In response to their attempts to investigate, the paranormal activity intensified. The family began finding knives placed where they would sit or sleep, seemingly intended to stab or at least injure them. Once again, Lee appeared to be the primary target. The family felt trapped in their own home. Even if they sold the house again and moved, whatever had followed them from their previous property would almost certainly follow them once more. When they stayed in hotels, they often found the now familiar symbols carved into the walls of their hotel room. Desperate, the family decided to try communicating with the entity through the messages that was left on the mirror. They hoped that by establishing some sort of communication that they might be able to reason with it. Initially this seemed to work, as the activity ceased quite briefly. However, the disturbances soon resumed and quickly escalated. The situation became dire, with the family increasingly fearful for their lives at this point. Well, everyone except Bill Sr., who he alternated between extreme fear of the danger that they were in and just complete indifference. He often criticised the money spent on various paranormal experts and investigators as a pure waste. Around 1988 or 1989, Deborah's family invited several shamans into their home to perform a cleansing ritual up in the attic. During this ceremony, Deborah saw what looked like a bony face with horns inside the insulation. Just as quickly as it had appeared, it then vanished. The shamans explained that this skull-like face was a sign of the entity that had been bothering them. They suggested that it might be connected to Bill Sr. somehow, possibly draining his energy or even possessing him. This made the family rethink Bill Sr.'s indifferent attitude and why he avoided dealing with these strange occurrences in their home. The shamans claimed that they had transferred the spirit into the family's dog to help manage it better. But shockingly, the dog died suddenly just a few days later, and the creepy events then continued. At this point, paranormal investigator Gary Kent became interested in this case. As soon as he got involved, the strange activities seemed to target him. Just like with Lee, objects were thrown at Kent and his clothes were mysteriously shredded right in front of him. One morning, while having breakfast at the house with the family, they heard bizarre snipping sounds. To their horror, clumps of Gary's hair fell to the floor as if cut by invisible hands. Feeling completely unsafe, Kent decided to quit this case and left the property immediately. I mean, who can blame him, right? Shortly afterward, Ed and Lorraine Warren began their investigation. Lorraine immediately identified an ancient demon in the property. They attempted a ritual to drive the demon away. During this procedure, Bill Sr. began to act really strange, growling and howling like a dog. At one point, he threatened to bite off Ed's hand, speaking in a voice that the family did not recognise. Then, just as suddenly, Bill returned to normal as if nothing had ever happened. Despite their best efforts, the Warrens could not help the Moffitt family, leaving them alone to confront this demonic force. The situation grew even worse. Lee started experiencing physical attacks. She was pushed several times, and on one occasion she was pulled into the kitchen pantry by unseen hands, feeling a tight grip around her throat. When the family managed to free her, red marks were clearly visible around her neck. Deborah, who had just given birth to her first child, decided to try and communicate with this entity once again. She specifically asked it not to harm the baby. Surprisingly, the entity responded, promising not to harm anyone except Lee. It then shared some fascinating information about itself and its intentions towards Lee. The entity claimed that back in the 1600s, some French monks performed satanic rituals and, in turn, promised to sacrifice a nun to it. However, they broke their promise by freeing the nun and helping her to escape. According to this entity, that nun was Lee in a previous life, meaning that now Lee belonged to him. Deborah continued communicating with this entity until one day a chilling message appeared stating that Lee would die in 10 days. On the 10th day, Lee was rushed to hospital with pneumonia. Although she eventually recovered, she spent several weeks in the hospital, during which she reported seeing a black shape constantly in her room. Meanwhile, the strange activities back at the Moffitt house, well, they suddenly stopped. When Lee returned back home, she continued to see this black shadow figure, which often took the shape of her mother, Dominica. Additionally, she frequently found the tubes on her oxygen tank slashed or disconnected entirely. One particularly ominous event happened one night when Bill Sr. woke up to find a spearhead in his bed, an object that no one in the family had ever seen or owned before. At the same time, a message appeared on the bathroom mirror stating that Lee was to be killed with the spear. Deborah refused to comply, and moments later, all the windows on the house's second floor shattered at the same time. Experts later examined the spear and identified it as a ritualistic tool, likely from Africa, although it appeared almost brand new at this point. Not long after these events, a parapsychologist called Dr. Evelyn Paglini came to investigate this case. Like the shamans before her, she suggested that Bill Sr. might be unintentionally giving the entity power and permission to stay in the house, thus providing it with energy. Additionally, she believed the entity's description of itself as Prince was more accurate than the family had ever realised. Paglini posited that the entity was indeed demonic and one of the 7 princes of hell. Like many other paranormal investigators that came before her, Paglini was unable to help this family, and the disturbances continued. In early 1990, events took another strange turn when Gary Kent returned to the Moffitt home for a second attempt to rid them of this evil presence. Once again, the entity's focus immediately shifted onto Gary. When Deborah asked why, the presence responded that it had known Gary in a past life. He was, according to this entity, one of the priests who had helped the nun escape. As such, it declared that it would settle for Gary's life instead of Lee's. The disturbances persisted, and Bill Sr.'s behaviour grew increasingly worrying and even more strange. He was often found alone, sitting bolt upright and seemingly speaking to an unseen figure. By late 1990, he had taken to sleeping in an upstairs room in the house. One evening, the family heard movement in that room and crept upstairs to see what was going on. They were shocked to see Bill Sr. sleepwalking and howling like a wolf. Bill Sr. had absolutely no recollection of these incidents. With nowhere left to turn, the family reluctantly agreed to try an exorcism on the property, even though it went against Lee's religious beliefs. During this exorcism, Bill Sr. had to be physically restrained from attacking the priest that was performing it. However, the exorcism failed, and the bizarre activity just continued. The family eventually concluded that Bill Sr. had been secretly communicating with this entity, possibly removing messages from the mirror before anyone else could see them. Deborah had become absolutely convinced that the entity was trying to persuade Bill Sr. to kill Lee, while Lee began to suspect that Bill wanted to kill her for a potential inheritance. Regardless of the truth, Bill Sr. voluntarily entered a mental health institution to assess his condition. During the 2 weeks that he was there, the activity at the property stopped completely. However, when the family went to pick him up from the hospital, the situation took another twist. Based on what Bill Sr. had told them, the doctors firmly believed that Lee had been orchestrating all of the bizarre events and wanted to evaluate her mental state. Ultimately, this led to Lee and Bill Sr. separating for a while. Instead of moving back in, Bill packed his belongings and left the property completely. With Gary also out of the house, the disturbances seemed to decrease dramatically. Although there were the occasional incidents, the activity had almost entirely stopped. When Gary Kent returned back to the house in 1992, the events resumed with the same intensity as before. One night Gary awoke to find a loaded shotgun in his bed. At this point, Gary decided to move to England and asked Deborah to communicate with the entity, requesting it to go with him. She did so, but the entity responded with several obscene messages, making it abundantly clear that it would not be leaving that house. On the day that Gary left, a final message appeared on the mirror. "Goodbye, my family." Whether the entity had left this message or not, well, the Moffitt family never experienced anything strange again after that message. However, they lived in a constant fear of its return and avoided speaking about it, worried that doing so might provide enough energy or acknowledgement for it to come back. Interestingly though, Gary had reported seeing the strange triangular symbol carved into the walls of his property back in England for several months afterwards, suggesting that the malevolent spirit had followed him across the pond. However, over time, these symbols appeared less frequently and eventually stopped altogether. The true nature of what happened to the Moffitt family remains a subject of debate, obviously. Was the family genuinely haunted by this entity? Did this presence appear by chance? Or was it summoned by Juanita through an ancient blood ritual to cure Dominica's health, only for her then to lose control? Something similar happened hundreds of years ago involving Lee and Gary in a different lifetime. Or was Bill Sr. behind all of these strange events, for reasons only known to him? Alternatively, could the entire situation have been orchestrated by the family for financial gain? The fact is, the Moffitt family haunting remains one of the most mind-blowing supernatural encounters on record. This case continues to captivate researchers to this day, likely because it touches on so many different areas of interest. Beyond the ghostly activity, there are questions about ancient rituals and blood sacrifices and how these might have influenced these events. There's also the intriguing idea of vengeful spirits pursuing those who have wronged them across centuries, suggesting the possibility of people living multiple lives. Above all else, if there is any truth to the entity being the Prince of Hell, then what does that say to us about the reality of such places or realms of existence? Even many in the paranormal world suggest that hell, at least as we understand it, is nothing but a legend. However, if there is any truth to the Moffitt family haunting, that stance might need to change. So, that's it for this video, folks. I can't thank you enough for spending the time hanging out with me today. If you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing. If not, you know what, we'll still be friends. It's all good. Take care of yourselves. Tell someone that you love them. And above all else, keep smiling.